I'm here with Nicholas Wolterstorff, Noah Porter Professor Emeritus of Philosophical Theology at Yale University. We're here at Yale today for a consultation on the theology of joy. Professor Wolterstorff, it's great to be here with you.
Thank you. Good to be back.
Yeah, welcome back. You know, as long as we've been doing this project, and we've been at it for a little while now, we still find that there's confusion right from the beginning. So let's start right here. As you see it, what is joy?
I imagine that part of before I answer the question, one reason for confusion, I suppose, is that there's been so little discussion of joy at least in the philosophical literature, and to the best of my knowledge, apart from some glowing passages in Karl Barth. Otherwise, there's not, to the best of my knowledge, all that much in the theological literature either. So what is joy? I take joy to be an emotion. My guess is that when some people hear that, they're going to hear it as a put-down of emotion, because then put-down of joy, because then it goes in the same bag as envy, fear, greed, and so forth. But I think that when we understand emotions, it's not a put-down of joy to describe it as an emotion. So let's start with emotion. I'm very taken by the understanding of emotion that you find in a philosopher, Robert Roberts, book of his on emotions. It is in many ways very close to in fact, virtually identical, I suppose, to the ancient Stoic understanding of emotion. But let me just give you what Bob Roberts, how he phrases it. An emotion, he says, is a concern-infused construal of reality. That's very dense sounding. But let's just unpack it into its two components. It involves a construal of reality and interpretation of reality. So if I'm envious, that presupposes that I'm interpreting reality as Michael being better than me in some way and getting more esteem and so forth. If I'm fearful, that presupposes construing reality as threatening me in some way. But it's got to be more than just an interpretation of some segment of reality. There's got to be concern. I've got to care about people praising Michael over me, or I've got to care about this threat and menace to my health and well-being that this fierce dog represents. So it's those two together, compact, but I think it's a very lucid way of understanding emotion. It's a concern-imbued, concern-infused construal of reality. So that's emotion in general. Joy I take to be that emotion which happens when I construe reality a certain way, and I believe it. I care about reality being a certain way, and I judge that it is that way. That's when joy ensues. I care that this dog leave and stop threatening me, and now I believe that it has stopped threatening me, and I feel some, well, I mean, not supernal joy, but some joy.
Relief.
Relief, yes,
right, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, so does that mean that joy is kind of context dependent then? Does it all have to be well with the world in order to experience
Or well
joy?
with some part of the world,
Yeah.
yes. So it's very context dependent, yes. And it's person dependent. That is, other people might not construe the situation the same way. Or if they do construe it the same way, they might not care in the same way. So it's person. Though much of it is generically human, nonetheless, it can be personal.
So I suppose we even have that in our common language when we say that we rejoice over something. We generally don't just say that we rejoice. We say that we rejoice over.
So another good point, Matt. Another important feature of joy, maybe not emotions in general, but certainly of joy, is that it's got a focus. It's got an object. You're joyful about something. You're not just joyful. I think it differs from happiness in that way. You can just feel happy, and if somebody says, well, what are you happy about? The answer is, I don't know, I just feel happy today. I just feel happy today. There's no particular thing, I just do. Whereas joy is always focused over something, concerning something, about something.
And it has fundamentally to do with your construal of it, not just that it is a certain way. There's something subjective here. Does that mean you could
construe it a certain way and you care about it? It's the blend of construal and care. Yep.
But on the construal piece, does that leave open the possibility then that you could kind of get it wrong? You could construe something, you could be rejoicing over something one ought not.
Oh yes,
Rejoice
happens all the time. People are very joyful over things about which you say, come on, you should not have concerned yourself. You should not have invested yourself like that in that particular thing. Yeah.
So then,
so misguided. So joy is always subject in principle to moral critique, to moral judgment. Yeah.
Interesting.
Whereas pleasure, sensations, enjoyment, you enjoy the ice cream, it doesn't seem appropriate to say, well, you shouldn't enjoy. I mean, you do or you don't.
So joy has to do with this moral judgment. It has, or it can be subject to moral judgment because it has to do with this proper
interpretation and this blend of interpretation and concern.
But then you said it has to be context dependent because of this orientation around an object of concern. But then you say interestingly in the paper that you prepared for today's consultation that one can rejoice without feeling happy.
Yes.
How can that be the case?
Yes. So I think one of the most interesting things to reflect on when you reflect on joy is exactly that phenomenon, that one can be miserable and feel joy. But the literature of the world testifies to that, and the New Testament testifies to that, the Old Testament. But Paul reciting his miseries, enslaved, bad-mouthed by various people and so forth. Nonetheless, I daily give joy. And it's because joy has this focus, has this object, this object of concern, that object of concern may be actual, real, gratified in the midst of all this other misery.
And so, if
you can feel, maybe some high school student is passionately concerned to get into Yale, and they've got bad stomach ache or whatever, when they get the letter from Yale that they're admitted. So they're in the middle of their intestinal upset. They're joyful.
And so
that brings it down rather low from Paul's elevated level, I do admit, but it's a pervasive phenomenon. Yeah.
Okay. But then the particular object of concern, then, if that object of concern is transcendent, if it's God, then that can give joy this sort of, in a sense, a certain kind of context independence. Then.
Yes. Yeah. So a striking feature of Paul, but Paul is not an odd man out here, but a striking feature of how Paul describes it is that his basic joy lies in the fact that cosmic salvation has now arrived in the world by way of the obedience of Jesus Christ. And that's a constant in his life. It doesn't go up and down. He cares intensely about that, given his Jewish background and so forth, and that's how he construes reality. So that's a pervasive context. It's a pervasive feature. That kind of joy is context, for Paul anyway, is context independent. It doesn't come and go.
And so there are certain features then of New Testament joy that sound a bit like Stoic joy, because there is this possibility that that someone who's rightly construing the world in Paul's sense, could be joyful at all times. Stoics talked about this, but you actually contrast Christian joy with Stoic joy.
Yeah, there is the similarity that you point out, but there's a deep dissimilarity. So a few words, as simple as possible, is about the ancient Stoics, who were members of a larger school known as the Eudaimonists in antiquity. The Eudaimonists said that all of us have to... The Eudaimonists thought that the estimable life, the admirable life, was the life that was lived well. Not the life that goes well, but the life that is lived well. And it was the Stoic idea that one feature of, well, and to live one's life well, one has to be aware of the natural goods and natural bads and establish the priorities among those, and then cultivate habits for this ordered pursuit of the goods and avoidance of the evils. They thought that among, now evil here, I don't mean moral evil, but just bad thing. The Stoics thought that among the bad things in human life were the negative emotions of fear and anxiety and disappointment and so forth. So they said that the wise person, they called this person the sage, it was always a male, the sage would so order his life as to get rid of these negative emotions. And the way to get rid of the negative emotions was not to concern yourself, here we come back to Bob Roberts' word, not to concern yourself with anything that's not in your own power to achieve. And what's in one's own power to achieve is the next obvious question. And they said, your virtue, and only your virtue. Being impoverished or not impoverished, that's not within your own power, and being sick or not sick, that's not within your own power. But what is within your own power is just your virtue. So care only about that. Don't care about the death of your children. One of the ancient Stoics was reported as not grieving upon the death of his child, and he was asked why that was, and he replied with what to my ear is icy coldness. But I always knew he would die. So don't invest yourself in don't invest yourself in anything other than your own virtue. And that's possible to achieve, they thought. Augustine disputed that from already in 10th book of the Confessions and in his later book, City of God. He doesn't think that's actually possible. But the Stoics thought it was possible to become totally virtuous. And when you're totally virtuous, you will be completely joyful, because remember, joy is the achievement of what you're invested in, and what you're invested in is your own virtue, and you are virtuous, and so you're joyful. They were challenged, you mean joyful on the torture rack? Challenged on this back in antiquity, and they bit the bullet and said, yes.
Yeah. But you say that the biblical picture is quite different, that actually, even in, you use the example of the book of Job. You say Job didn't kind of just detach from his situation in order to manage his hardship, but instead he turned to God and asked for God's intervention to actually change.
Job was a Stoic, virtuous person, right? I mean, that's how he's presented there. When his friends who become accusers say, well, but Job, there must be some bad thing that you did, Job just resists it. He says, this is not true. But he does not become a Stoic. He laments the miseries, and he petitions God to be released from his miseries. No Stoic petitions God to be released from misery. Yeah. Because you don't care about the miseries. Job cared about them, cared about his impoverishment, cared about the death of his children, cared about the bad-mouthing by his friends, and so forth.
And so the recourse to a God who intervenes in history is in some ways the thing that allows one to actually stay invested in the things of the world and yet experience joy.
Exactly. Exactly. But it's not going to be comprehensive joy the way the Stoics, the way the Stoic sage presumably experienced comprehensive joy. It'll be focused, but one longs for the end of the misery so that one's joy can be complete.
So there's an eschatological
orientation. There's an eschatological dimension to it, absolutely.
So then how do we all want more joy in our lives. Given this account of joy, a rich account, biblical account, how do we cultivate joy in our lives, in our communities? How do we cultivate joy?
So that's a good and rich question. Let me answer it in two parts. We do what Paul did. Take joy in God's cosmic redemption achieved in Jesus Christ. And take joy in the success of smaller projects. But I also think, and this is going to sound extremely odd to anybody who's got Stoic inclinations, there should always be parts of our lives in which we don't take joy. What's happening in Iraq to Christians and Muslims in Iraq and Syria. We should not get ourselves into a situation where we take joy in that or overlook it so that we don't not take joy in it. So in the life of the Christian, there should always be substantial components of what happens in this world about which one says this should not be, and one takes no joy in it whatsoever. So that means there should be a quality of discontent, I suppose is the right word. Never in this world complete happiness. I think going the Stoic route is a deep mistake.
And deep investment in the world that involves necessarily then a turning to God to ask for God's intervention to change what is wrong in the world.
And taking joy in the confidence that that will happen. But taking discontent in the fact that it's not happening now.
Great. Well, Professor Wolterstorff, I thank you so much for your time. Look forward to continuing the conversation today and tomorrow as we have our consultation. Thank you for being here with us.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure. Thank you.